That night, I was an old man on the night shift at a stained truck yard. Sure, my life would end like the concrete under my boots, spotted and forgotten. Then I saw a dark shape by the oil pit.
Oh no, poor
I
thing.
almost walked away until one tiny paw
Tôi
moved,
không muốn bỏ mặc mày ở đây, nhưng tôi phải
and
đi thôi.
nothing in that
Tạm biệt
yard
nhé.
felt simple again. It was a question I couldn't ignore anymore, or walk past in the dark. By the time you reach my age, sounds have a way of sorting themselves. The hum of the highway becomes one long note. The wind through broken fences, another. That night at the old truck yard, I was just walking my usual loop, counting those familiar notes in my head. The yard had been quiet for years, a graveyard of rusted trailers and stained concrete. I kept an eye on it for the county, mostly to keep kids out and catch the occasional copper thief. The only other regular visitors were crows, raccoons, and the wind pushing trash across the gravel. Out by the far fence, near the shallow waste pit, the air always changed. The smell of old oil and wet metal settled low, thicker than the mist. Even after they drained the pit and hauled most of the barrels away, the ground still shone in places when the yard lights hit it just right. That night, a thin fog hugged the low spots. It was early winter, the kind that makes your breath hang like unanswered questions. I walked slower along the fence, boots crunching bits of broken glass, my flashlight swinging in a lazy arc ahead of me. The beam slid over weeds and a discarded tire, then stopped. For a second, I thought it was just another spill of black against the darker ground. But the shape at the edge of the old pit was too clean, too carefully folded, like something had been placed there and forgotten. I stepped closer, lowering the light. It wasn't a torn tub or a soaked cardboard box. It was fur, if you could call it that, slick and matted into dark waves. A body, small but not small enough to be a house cat. Everything about it whispered too late before my mind found the word bobcat. I'd seen bobcats around the edges of town for years, shy shadows slipping between cedar posts and ditches. This one had no edges left, just a wet outline against the stained earth. It lay on its side, still as a rock, one paw lost in the reflection of the yard light in a slick of oil. My first thought wasn't noble. It was simple and tired, not again. Not another reminder of the things we'd spilled and dumped and walked away from in this town. I sighed, feeling the old ache in my knees, and told myself I'd call the county office in the morning to pick up the body. The night around us held its breath. Distant trucks sighed along the interstate beyond the trees. But here it was just the faint tick of cooling metal and the soft tap of a loose chain on a pole. I shut off my flashlight just to see how dark it really was. In the dim wash of the security light, the Bobcat was barely more than a smudge. I told myself to keep moving, to finish my round and go back to the little office with its burnt coffee and humming fridge. But something old and restless in me insisted I look once more, properly, before I left it there. I stepped closer until the oil slick smell was thick enough to taste. I leaned forward, hands braced on my thighs, the way old men do when they're trying to see the ground without kneeling. Up close, I could make out faint spots beneath the black sheen, ghosted rings on its flanks. I muttered, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet yard. You picked the worst place in the county to lie down. Friend, I wasn't expecting an answer. I wasn't expecting anything at all. Really. The story felt finished. That's why the next moment landed in me like a dropped wrench. Because when I leaned closer, squinting at the dark shape, the smallest front paw twitched. Not a trick of the light, not wind in the grass, just one slow, uncertain movement, as if the night itself had reached up and tapped my chest from the inside. I froze the way only old bones can, every joint stiff while my mind scrambled to catch up. That tiny paw flexed once, drawing a faint crescent in the slick dirt, then went still again. The rest of the cat didn't move at all, like its body hadn't heard the news that it was still here. I'd worked around oil my whole life. Highway spills, jackknifed tankers, leaky underground tanks. You get to know what it does to soil, to water, to anything unlucky enough to lie in its path. I also knew better than to wade into old waste with nothing but stubbornness and a flashlight. The Bobcat lay just outside the deepest stain, as if it had dragged itself away from the worst of it and then run out of strength. The fur around its shoulders and sides glistened, heavy and clumped. It breathed so shallowly I had to watch the rise and fall against the distant yard light. I pulled my scarf up over my mouth, more out of habit than need, and stood there thinking the way men think when they have too much history and not enough answers. There were no rescue vans on call, no night staff at some gleaming clinic, just me, the cat, and a yard full of old mistakes. The easy thing would have been to look away, to tell myself nature would take its course. I'd said those words before, standing beside ditches that smelled like gasoline after rain, signing forms that said contained when we all knew better. Those memories pushed against my chest now, as insistent as that moving paw. I thought about the creek that used to run clear behind my childhood home, before a truck overturned one spring and turned it into a rainbow ribbon of poison. We'd watched dead fish collect in the eddies, their bellies bright coins in the current. It had taken years before frogs trusted that water again. My flashlight rested heavy in my palm. I swept it across the yard, half hoping for another human shape. Some witness who could tell me what a 70-year-old man was supposed to do with an oil-soaked wildcat at midnight. The yard, faithful as ever, answered with silence. I checked the fence line for gaps, the ground for tracks. The cat had come from the direction of the old service road, where a culvert ran under the highway. Maybe it had followed the smell of rodents. Maybe it had been chased by nothing more than its own hunger across bad ground. There was an old wooden pallet leaning against the fence, warped but still holding together. A stack of chipped plastic bins sat nearby, catching rainwater that had turned leaf brown and cold. I looked at those, then at the cat, and some slow, creaking part of my mind began to move. I'm not a vet, I told the Bobcat quietly, as if it cared about job titles. But I did spend 40 years cleaning up after men who thought they knew what they were doing. The words floated out and disappeared into the damp air. The cat's ear flicked once, almost imperceptibly. The memory of my last big spill sat just behind my eyes. A tanker had rolled in a snowstorm, coating a slope above a small valley. We'd done everything we could, but some stains never really leave. Looking at that small, blackened shape now, it felt less like an accident and more like a long echo finally reaching me. I took one step back, then another, letting my eyes adjust to the dark again. There was no rushing this. not with my knees, and not with whatever thin chance the cat had left. I needed buckets, the pallet, the hose by the office, and the kind of patience you only find when you're almost out of time. Inside the little office, the clock over the coffee maker said 12:15, though it had been 5 minutes fast for years. I grabbed the old green hose coiled under the sink, the one we use to rinse dust off inspection trucks, and tested the nozzle with my thumb. The spit of water sounded louder than it had any right to be. In the back room, under a shelf of forgotten road cones, sat a crate of absorbent pads left over from some long ago contract. They were stiff at the edges, but still serviceable. I took a stack under one arm, the coil of hose in the other, and shuffled back out into the cold. Every step felt like a small argument with myself. The yard light threw long, lonely shadows over the cracked asphalt. I dragged the hose across the ground, listening to it whisper over gravel and old cigarette butts. When I reached the spigot near the fence, my fingers did that clumsy dance older hands do with cold metal and stubborn valves. The hose shuddered, then filled. I didn't go straight to the Bobcat. First, I carried the warped pallet over and set it down a few feet from the slick, patting it like you would a tired mule. Then I lined the top with pads, turning the rough wood into something almost soft. I told myself it was to keep oil off the cat's skin. It felt more like building a small, uncertain altar. The Bobcat lay just as I'd left it, except for the rise and fall of its ribs, which I could now see clearly. Breath in, breath out. A quiet argument with the dark. I knelt slowly beside it, the cold seeping through my work pants, and slipped a pad between its body and the worst of the stain. Easy, I murmured, to both of us. The fur under my gloved hands was slick, disturbing, like weeds pulled from a polluted pond. I'd promised myself not to think of it as a pet or a symbol, just an animal in trouble. But the tremor in its side when I touched it sent a crack through that resolve. Using the pads like gentle wedges, I inched the cat's body toward the pallet. Every few inches, I stopped to let it catch its breath, though I wasn't sure if that pause was for the Bobcat or for my own racing heart. The night kept watch, close and quiet, as if the whole yard were leaning in. When the bobcat's shoulder finally reached the edge of the pallet, its head rolled slightly, bringing its face toward mine. A streak of clean fur ran between its eyes, a pale bridge between two darknesses. In that streak, I saw faint spots, the wild pattern that the oil hadn't erased yet. I opened the hose just enough to get a shy, steady trickle. The water ran over my knuckles, cold enough to make them ache. Carefully, I let it fall first onto a pad, then guided the wet cloth toward the cat's fur, avoiding its eyes, its nose, the raw places where the coat had thinned. Oil and water don't mix. I'd watched that truth slide across rivers and storm drains my whole life. But enough water, given time, can coax loosened dirt away from skin, from stone, from the stubborn memory of a spill. Here, though, I wasn't trying to clean the yard, just to give this small body a chance. The bobcat twitched once when the damp pad touched its side, a shiver that ran from shoulder to tail. Its paw moved again, fingers curling slightly, claws just beginning to slip from their sheaths. I waited, murmuring nonsense, the kind of steady sounds people make for newborns and skittish horses. We stayed like that for a long time, the hose hissing faintly, the pads soaking up more darkness than they gave back. I worked slowly, not chasing perfection, just trying to lighten the load on its chest, its legs. Somewhere in the middle of it, my knees stopped complaining and my back stopped counting the minutes. There was only water, fur, and breath. By the time I stepped back, the worst of the oil had been lifted from the bobcat's shoulders and sides. Its fur still clumped in dark ropes, but here and there the original tawny colour peeked through, like dry grass after a flood retreats. I shut off the hose and listened as the quiet settled back in. The cat's eyes were half open now, dull but present. They did not look grateful. They looked bewildered, heavy, as if each second cost effort. I recognized that expression from hospital rooms and funerals, from mornings when getting out of bed had felt like lifting a road sign. Being alive, at its edges, can be strangely exhausting. I could have tried to wrap it in more pads, to build some makeshift sling and wrestle it into my truck. I pictured myself driving through town at 1 in the morning, an oil-streaked Bobcat on the passenger seat, like some strange confession. My doctor would have a word or two about that kind of strain on my heart. Instead, I stepped away and surveyed the yard. Beyond the pit, dry ground sloped gently toward a stand of scrubby willows that hid the old drainage dip. Weeds had started reclaiming that channel years ago, stitching the scars of concrete with green. Water pooled there whenever it rained hard enough, drawing frogs and insects back. I fetched 2 of the rain-filled bins and set them near the pallet, tipping them just enough that a thin ribbon of clean water spilled into a shallow depression I scraped into the dirt. If the cat found the strength to crawl, I wanted it to meet water that hadn't already betrayed it. There's a temptation, when you've spent decades fixing things, to reach too far, to take control of every outcome, wrestle each frayed situation into a neat repair. Tonight, the line between help and interference felt very thin. This was a wild animal, not a project, not a second chance mailed directly to my guilt. I pulled off my gloves, flexing my numb fingers, and studied the bobcat's chest. The breathing was still shallow but more regular now, as if each inhale met less resistance. A faint tremor ran through its hindquarters, then faded. Behind us, a truck moaned along the interstate, its engine note rising and falling like an old song. "Here's the deal," I said softly. "Half to the cat, half to the gravel under my boots. I've moved what I can. The rest is up to you. And whatever this land still remembers about being kind." The words felt odd in my mouth, but they hung there for a moment before dissolving into the damp air. I dragged an old metal crate over from beside the fence and set it a respectful distance away, making myself a seat. From there, I could watch without looming. The yard light buzzed overhead, throwing a cone of tired yellow over us. In its edge, the cat was just a shadow reshaping itself, very slowly, into possibility. Minutes became an hour. My breath ghosted in front of me, keeping time. A train horn called somewhere beyond the trees, followed by the distant rattle of cars. Every so often, a night bird would cut across the sky, its wings a brief whisper between heavier silences. At one point, The bobcat's head lifted a fraction, nose testing the air. It caught the scent of water, or metal, or old oil, and stilled again. Its whiskers, tipped with dark beads, trembled. I stayed still, hands open on my knees, offering nothing more than presence. Growing old, you learn that some of the most important things you do are also the smallest. A hand on a shoulder, a phone call answered at midnight, a silent chair pulled up in a waiting room. Sitting in that half-dead yard, keeping company with a half-clean bobcat, felt like more of the same, only this time. The patient wore spots instead of worry lines. Word travels oddly in small towns. By the next evening, before my shift even started, my neighbour had already mentioned some kind of wildcat trouble at the old truck yard. I hadn't called anyone yet, but it seemed the fence or the wind had been talking behind my back. I drove in early, curious and a little uneasy. The yard looked the same at first glance. Rusted trailers, sagging chain link, the faint smell of old oil soaking up the afternoon sun. But near the waste pit, something had changed. The pallet was empty. The pads lay scattered like molted feathers. The bobcat was nowhere in sight. My first feeling wasn't disappointment. It was relief. Wide and quiet. The ground where the cat had lain bore only a faint, oil-dark imprint. Little paw marks, half clear, led toward the drainage ditch and then disappeared into a tangle of weed and shadow. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was saving. I walked the fence line anyway, scanning for signs of struggle, of a body dragged off by coyotes or dogs. There were only old footprints, my own, the memory of work boots and worry. The yard hummed with late-day insects, everything edged with that dusty gold light the Midwest keeps for itself in autumn. Near the office, I found a battered thermos sitting on the step. Its lid off, steam curling faintly. Next to it lay a note held down by a small stone. It was from Ruth at the diner, written in her slanting script. Heard you had company last night. Figured you'd need something warm. Try not to bring it inside. I chuckled, the sound surprising me. Somehow the story had shortened itself in its travel. old man, wildcat, oil, midnight. Folks had filled in the gaps with the kind of drama people like to tell over coffee. No one was talking about the years we'd left this yard to soak and sink into the groundwater. Not yet. That weekend at church, during coffee hour in the basement, someone asked if it was true I'd rescued a big cat from a toxic pit. I corrected the story gently. Did what I could, I said. Mostly just made sure it had a way out. An old farmer nearby nodded, as if that were the only reasonable approach to anything. It wasn't the Bobcat people kept circling back to, it was the pit. Reminders travel in pairs. Before long, someone mentioned the creek behind the school that still ran strange after hard storms. Someone else recalled the time the drainage ditch foamed during a summer rain. The Bobcat, unseen now, had tugged a loose thread in our town's memory. At the next council meeting, the truck yard finally made it onto the agenda. I sat in the back, listening as younger voices argued about budgets and liability, while older ones weighed history against fatigue. I spoke once, my voice rough, to say only that we owed more to the land than warning signs and chain link. No one promised miracles, but they did vote before the coffee went cold to apply for a state grant to assess the site. It wasn't a clean-up, not yet a first step, like a paw twitch at the edge of a stain. Outside, the night felt a little less heavy when we stepped onto the sidewalk. Walking back to my truck, I caught myself scanning the dark edges of the parking lot. I wasn't really expecting spots or whiskers, just signs of movement, of life negotiating with all we'd left behind. In the reflection of a puddle, streetlight shimmered over a thin film on the water's surface, swirling slowly. I stood there a long time, watching that outline break and rejoin, thinking of the bobcat's ribs rising and falling under my hands. Our town, like that animal, had been lying beside something poisonous for a very long time. Maybe, just maybe, it was starting to shift. A week passed. Then another. The truck yard rolled through its small routines, gates unlocked at dusk. Rounds walked. Coffee poured. Logs signed. The waste pit dried at the edges, leaving cracked patterns like old maps. I still checked the drainage ditch each night, though it became less about the cat and more about the habit of wandering. One late evening, as the first real cold of winter pushed in, I heard an unfamiliar sound near the far fence. Not the clatter of loose metal or the sharp bark of a stray dog, but a low, questioning yowl, cut short. It threaded through the hum of the highway, delicate but insistent. I stopped, flashlight held low, and waited. The cry came again, from the direction of the willows. It held no panic, just a rough-edged announcement, the kind you might make when returning to a place you're not sure you trust anymore. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a cautious kind of hope. I didn't go charging toward it. The night has its own traffic rules. Instead, I turned off the flashlight and stayed where I was, letting my eyes adjust. The yard light cast long fingers across the grass, turning weeds into soft silhouettes. For a moment, everything settled into a painting: fence, trees, sky, and the faint suggestion of movement at the center. There, between two saplings, stood a shape about knee-high, tail low, head lifted. Its outline was sharper now, no longer blurred by oil. I couldn't see the pattern on its coat, but the posture spoke clearly enough: alert, undecided, very much alive. The bobcat watched the yard with the suspicion of someone who remembers exactly where they almost didn't make it. We faced each other across 20 yards of battered ground, neither of us moving closer. A breeze shifted, carrying my scent toward the trees. The cat's ears twitched, catching it. For a moment I thought it might turn and leave, but it simply shifted its weight, as if adjusting some internal scale between caution and curiosity. I remembered the advice of an old wildlife officer I'd once met at an accident scene. Best help for most wild things, he'd said, is to get out of the way, then fix what broke their path in the first place. At the time, I'd been too busy filling out spill reports to really take it in. Now his words landed like they'd been waiting years for an open spot. So I didn't speak. I didn't reach for the hose or the pads or any tool at all. I simply stood, an aging guard in a yard of aging machines, and let the bobcat take its measure of this place. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of all the choices we hadn't made yet, After a long while, the bobcat stepped forward, just once, placing a paw on the very edge of the old stain. It sniffed, whiskers quivering, then turned its head toward the drainage ditch, where the water sometimes pooled clear after rain. A soft chuff escaped its throat, more breath than sound. Then it moved, slipping along the fence line toward the back corner, where the lot met the overgrown edge of a fallow field. The cat's body, lean now, flowed over broken concrete and weeds with a grace that made the whole yard look clumsy. In 2 heartbeats, it reached the hole under the lower rail and was gone. I stayed there long after, listening to the rustle of its passing fade into the grasses beyond. The yard felt different behind me, not cleaner. Not yet, but less abandoned by everything that mattered. Another small signal had gone out. This time, I knew I had to answer with more than a watchful chair. The grant approval arrived in late spring, tucked between utility bills and advertisements in the county office mail. By then, the truck yard had settled into that hopeful kind of limbo towns know well, promises on paper, problems still on the ground. The letter moved us from one category to the next by a few cautious inches. Surveyors came first, their bright vests and measuring rods looking almost theatrical against the rusted trailers. They walked the perimeter, took soil samples, made notes. I watched from my usual chair, feeling both protective and exposed, like someone had come to take measurements in my own living room. The tests confirmed what we all already knew. The soil near the pit was carrying a long memory of oil and other things best left unnamed. But the report also said something we'd forgotten to hope for. The contamination hadn't spread as far as it could have. The land had held its line better than we deserved. Cleanup crews followed, moving with a patient, deliberate energy that reminded me of surgery. They scraped away stained earth, lined new containment trenches, and laid sheets of thick fabric across vulnerable spots. No one worked miracles. They just kept at it, day after day, with shovels and small machines and cautious optimism. The first real storm of summer hit just as they were finishing the drainage improvements. Clouds built like distant mountains on the horizon, then rolled in heavy and dark. I stood at the edge of the yard, raincoat pulled tight, and watched the sky tip its basin over us. Water drummed on metal roofs and poured into the newly carved channels. Where the old pit had once gathered rainbow-slick puddles, the rain now ran clean into a lined trench, then out toward a small, newly widened wetland by the willows. Someone had planted native grasses there, their bright green spears jostling in the downpour. The water rose among them, muddy at first, then clearing as the storm stretched on. Lightning stitched the horizon, followed by the low roll of thunder. I listened to the new system take its first real test, the gurgle of water in pipes, the steady overflow into the wetland, the absence of that old, oily sheen that had once been as familiar as my own reflection. The yard was still scarred, but it was learning a different way to drain. Through the curtain of rain, near the edge of the field, a form appeared on the crest of a small rise. At first I thought it was just one of the surveyors returning for forgotten equipment. Then the shape lifted its head, and even from a distance I could see the set of the shoulders, the low, thoughtful curve of the tail. The bobcat leaner now, fur brushed sleek by the storm, stood watching the water's new path. Its coat, even under the grey sky, carried the subtle spill of spots I'd only glimpsed under yardlight months before. There was no dramatic pose, no convenient beam of sun, just an animal standing in the rain, taking stock. It looked toward the wetland, then toward the yard, then back again, as if tracing invisible lines between past and present. For a heartbeat, I felt we were sharing the same map, each of us noting the places where things had gone wrong and the tentative routes around them. The bobcat stepped down the slope, moving with easy certainty, and skirted the edge of the wetland. Its paws left temporary prints in the softened earth, quickly blurred by falling drops. At the far side, it paused once more, gave a small shake, sending water from its whiskers, and slipped into the tall grass. The storm kept on, indifferent to our small dramas. But as I watched the rain trace cleaner paths across the yard, following edges we'd finally bothered to reshape, I felt something inside me settle. Not a grand redemption, not a perfect fix, just the quiet knowledge that we had, at last, interfered in the right direction. Years have a way of thinning out sharp memories. sanding their edges until they feel almost like stories you heard about someone else. But some nights still come back whole: the smell of wet metal, the tremor of a tiny paw, the first time a wild gaze meets your own without needing anything more than space. The truck yard is different now. The old trailer's mostly gone, the pit filled and capped, the wetland by the willows thick with reeds and dragonflies. My job has changed with it. I walk less for security and more out of habit. A retired man checking on a place that once kept his secrets and now shares them with anyone willing to read a report. They planted wildflowers along the fence last year. In spring, they come up in modest bursts: yarrow, coneflower, black-eyed Susan. Kids from the school sometimes tour the site with teachers, learning about runoff and responsibility. I stand back when that happens, pretending to fuss with paperwork, listening to their questions float across ground that once answered only with silence. I still scan the edges at dusk. Old habits are loyal. Most evenings, all I see are deer slipping through the fields, or the flash of a fox's tail, or a pair of raccoons arguing over something unimportant. The Bobcat is not a regular character in this new chapter. Wild things, properly, have other places to be. Every now and then, though, I find signs. A clear set of tracks by the drainage outlet after a heavy rain. The pads sharp and distinct in the softened earth. A tuft of tawny fur caught on a low branch near the wetland, marked faintly with those spotted shadows. A scent on the wind that prickles some old animal part of my brain. Once, early one morning after a night of wind, I found prints smaller than the ones I'd grown used to seeing. They meandered along the fence, crossed my own footprints, and headed toward the field. Not proof of a family, not a tidy circle of gratitude, just evidence that lives move forward even when you're not there to witness every step. People sometimes ask me about the oil cat, as they've taken to calling it. The story has shrunk and swelled with retelling. Sometimes I heroically hoisted a snarling beast out of a black lake. Sometimes I cradled it like a baby. Sometimes it returns each year to nod solemnly at my trailer before disappearing into the night. I let the tales run. They're mostly harmless. When I tell it, I keep it simple. I say there was a night when I thought a bobcat was gone, and then it wasn't. I say I did a few small things, a pallet, some pads, a trickle of water, and then stayed out of the way while it decided what to do with the chance. I say the real work came later, with paperwork and shovels and meetings that ran too long. What I don't always put into words is the way that tiny movement, the flex of a paw at the edge of a stain, rearranged something in me. After a lifetime of cleaning up other people's messes, I'd started to believe my job was mostly to manage endings. That night, in that ugly yard, a beginning slipped in through the side door. On clear evenings now, I sit on the new bench by the wetland, watching the water take its unhurried path through reeds and stones. Red-winged blackbirds call from the cattails. Frogs offer their low, insistent music. The air smells less like old oil and more like mud and warm grass, and the sharp, clean edge of rain on the way. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I think I see a shadow pause at the tree line, a lean form, spotted and self-contained, watching me as I watch the water. Maybe it's the same bobcat. Maybe it's another that's found its way along cleaner routes. Either way, I don't move toward it. I simply nod, the way old neighbours do from opposite sides of a street. The prints it leaves will fade, as all tracks do. The pallet rotted away seasons ago. My own steps are slower, my routes shorter. But that moment leaning closer, sure the story was over. Then seeing life insist on one more breath hasn't washed out with the weather. It remains a small, steady mark on the inside of my days, like a paw print pressed into drying concrete, hidden now beneath everything we've finally learned to build better. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.